Hi everyone, Phil Travis here, EOU, Week 2, History 448, Modern Russia. Today's topic, or this week's topic I should say, is the Bolshevik Revolution, or the October Revolution of 1917. And of course, as you guys and gals have all been noticing in your reading, there's of course two revolutions in 1917. So we're going to consider this time period. First of all, I wanted to mention something we need to remember is that there are some long-term causes for the occurrence of the Bolshevik Communist Revolution of October of 1917. There was a long history of autocratic control by the czars in Russia that went back hundreds of years, and of course this was a monarchical system that was very powerful in its ability to control the direction of the country. It was also a semi-feudal society, and in some respects, this kind of semi-feudal peasant society, in a way, lived less in the grip of the autocratic control of those centered in St. Petersburg. But of course, the leadership in St. Petersburg also did very little to help the well-being of the people in this peasant society, and so many of course peasants formed Soviets or village communes in Russia, and of course when they had famine, these types of issues, they were largely on their own to deal with these. It were also caused by long-term causes. Were also an industrializing economy. Industrialization came late to Russia, and of course as Russia starts to industrialize, it has to do so. It has to do so with speed. Things in Russia had a tendency at the turn of the 19th and 20th century to happen fast. And so the industrializing economy also created working classes that suffered from the same kind of maladies that you found in other countries: poor wages, poor living conditions, problems with inflation, and these types of things, poor working conditions, and so forth. Russia was, in a way, like the United States, an expansionist country. As depicted here, you can see the expansion of the Russian state. And by the time we get to the October Revolution of 1917, Russia, of course, is a country that includes not just Russians, but Russians and people of other nationalities. And World War I and, of course, the October Revolution were not motivated because of a Russian nationalism. Instead, it was a multi-ethnic society with different identities, and in most of the socialist revolutionaries, whether it were the Bolshevik communists or the social revolutionaries, they all understood that the suffering of the people at the low level was unique regardless of national identity. And so the Russian Revolution was not necessarily, it shouldn't be understood as being motivated primarily by a Russian nationalism, but more by a cry for the needs of the basic necessities, the needs for land, for bread, and so forth. Russia, of course, was, as I mentioned, a czarist autocratic state. The last czar of Russia, who reigned from 1898 until his ouster in 1917, was Tsar Nicholas II, and he's pictured here with his wife. Tsar Nicholas II definitely is one of the most troubled of the Russian leaders. Tsar Nicholas II led his country into two ultimately very unpopular wars, the Russo-Japanese War and World War I. And even though one might say that the Russo-Japanese War was a draw, from the Russian standpoint, it was really a rather humiliating defeat. The Russian Navy was completely destroyed by the Japanese at one point in that war. And the truth of the matter is the Japanese were really more the victor of that conflict than the Russians. And the Japanese understood this. This was the first time, in their view, that an Asian power had defeated a much powerful or much larger European power. And of course, the Tsar also took the people of Russia into World War I. And by 1916, World War I was uniquely unpopular in Russia and was uniquely associated with issues of starvation and general want and need for the people of Russia. Tsar Nicholas was also a repressive autocratic leader, and he used secret police. He sent people to gulags. He had people put to death, and he put revolutions down with violence. Pictured here, of course, is probably the best example of how Nicholas II, when he becomes faced increasingly with cries for reform, for more representative and more responsive government, his reactions, as demonstrated here, are almost always the wrong types of reactions. At the Bloody Sunday Massacre of 1905, Russian imperial troops fire on a crowd of demonstrators outside the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, the Tsar's residence. And the protesters were calling for things like better working conditions and a more responsive leadership, and Tsar Nicholas II did not hesitate to put down the revolution with violent force. And it was this kind of intense violence and repression that figures like Lenin and other members of groups like the Bolsheviks came to believe that the czarist status quo, if you will, had to be eliminated, that this form of leadership had to be done away with, and the country needed to start fresh. So we mentioned some long-term causes: Tsarism, the semi-feudal society and the problems related to it, industrialization and the problems related to natural exploitation of industrial working classes. Short-term causes were the First World War, which led to issues with starvation, with worker exploitation, with a general unpopularity of the conflict on the home front. It was also brought on by political destabilization. Russia became fractured among a variant of political groups. And generally speaking, all of the main political groups, or at least all of the socialist ones, believed that the fate of the country had to be the development of a constitutional republic, a democracy, if you will. And of course, the one individual who did not agree with that was, of course, V.I. Lenin. Lenin, the Bolshevik leader, will be a significant factor in why the revolution actually happens, the October Revolution, and he will be motivated by the creation of dictatorship, the creation of a dictatorship of the people, if you will, as he would have termed it. But he was motivated by total Soviet control and a belief that any kind of collaboration or compromise with the bourgeois, the capitalists, would result in a failure of the revolution. And so World War I brings on starvation, unpopularity, protests, labor riots, and it causes also political destabilization as various socialist movements grapple for power. And of course, the work of Lenin you will see, factor fundamentally into why the revolution occurs the way it does. So, of course, as I mentioned, as a result of World War I, particularly, not only, but particularly as a result of World War I, Russia faced starvation of quite horrific magnitudes. And, of course, this was a factor in popular unrest, and it was something that the Bolsheviks will use to capitalize on their movements against the government, as well as other groups. Long-term causes of the conflict: a professionalized group of revolutionaries, V.I. Lenin, of course, and perhaps I should have put Lenin here instead of in the short-term causes. Overall, as I mentioned, go back to the original slide, serfdom. Russia was unsuited for a traditional communist revolution as envisioned by Marx. And so Lenin and his colleagues, Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin, who we'll be talking about quite a bit in this class, organized themselves as professional revolutionaries who, as I mentioned in last week's presentation, will seek to create an elite leadership, a dictatorship of the proletariat that can lead Russia immediately to socialism. Lenin is portrayed here as a heroic revolutionary figure, and Lenin, of course, had been agitating for reform for almost 3 decades at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. His brother, of course, was involved in a plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander. He was jailed more than once. He was exiled more than once. He was exiled after the Revolution of 1905, of course, and he returns in April of 1917. Interestingly, Lenin's return was from Germany. He had been living in Switzerland. And, of course, one of the criticisms that his opponents would have for him is that he had more kind of experience with books in Switzerland than with working, with industrial workers, for example. But Lenin will be brought back into Russia largely by the Germans, who knew Lenin was an unpopular person, or at least he was an unsavory person for a lot of people in Europe. He was a passionate revolutionary who very much believed that his understanding of Bolshevism, his understanding of communism was the right, and he sought this continentally. And so the Germans knew that he could be an inspiration for revolution in Russia, and they helped to smuggle him back into Russia, where he could take action and foment revolution that might achieve Russia's goal of Germany's goal of getting Russia out of the war, so that Germany could focus on the Western Front against the British, the French, and of course now the arriving Americans. Lenin was a passionate speaker, and he had a unique ability. Oftentimes he was exceptionally eager in the revolution, and he used his power as an orator and a speaker to mobilize people to support the Bolsheviks on the basis of general grievances. He did not want to share power. He very much opposed his other socialist colleagues, socialist revolutionaries, the Mensheviks, and so forth. And he very much pressed for the use of violence and revolution, including terrorist violence. And ultimately, as he leads the revolution, Lenin will break with a very well-accepted socialist principle at this time. And this is one of the, and I suppose one might argue that this is one of the negative consequences of Leninism, is that as a result of Leninism, socialism in many countries of the West came to be perceived as something that was synonymous with dictatorship. In reality, the exact opposite was true. In reality, socialism was, throughout the 1800s, generally understood as an ideal that would lead to democracy, that it was an ideal that was opposing dictatorship, opposing monarchy, opposing autocracy, and creating a democracy. Most socialists believed in a constitutional democratic republic style leadership. Most socialists believed that communism could only happen with a continuation of an epoch of capitalism, that socialism had to be transitioned to. Lenin, of course, breaks from this. And Lenin believes that he can use a dictatorship to speed socialism, to create a socialist society immediately. And this was something that actually shocked many socialists in Russia and as the news spread in other parts of the world. It was very much a break with a well-accepted socialist principle, which was democracy. Trotsky here, I just wanted to mention, he's in your reading quite a bit. He was the Commissar of War under the Bolsheviks, and after the revolution begins and the Bolsheviks become the leadership in Russia, he was the head of the Red Army and made it into a fairly decent fighting force given the circumstances. Here's a map of Russia. You see in the red, you see Sochi too. This is obviously a modern map of Russia, but you see Moscow and St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg during the time we're talking about is Petrograd. So when you're reading, they changed the name. And so the name of the city was Petrograd. And then, of course, later it will be changed to Leningrad. But Petrograd, so when you read the Petrograd Soviet, they're talking about the Soviet revolutionaries that are in St. Petersburg. And if you see Finland right there, which was controlled by Russia at the time, that's where Lenin was for much of the time before he comes out into the open in 1917. Remember, Lenin was kind of under the radar. He was hiding. He would speak to his Bolshevik comrades, but he would do so secretly and on the outskirts of St. Petersburg, and in some cases in Finland. So he had to be very careful because he was a wanted man, of course. So the Bolshevik Revolution, of course, the Tsar was overthrown, and the Tsar was overthrown in the so-called February Revolution. And the February Revolution resulted in the establishment of a provisional government. And the riots were most acute, for example, in Petrograd, in Petersburg. And the Petrograd riot of 1917 was particularly violent. And it was here that the Bolshevik communists were the strongest. Of course, the Bolsheviks were, even in Petrograd, the Bolsheviks were not fully capable of having total control over the socialists in that region. They were a small group, a minority group. Their primary newspaper was only received by nearly maybe 100,000 subscribers at the time. They were a small group, and there were many different socialist groups within the country, and of course that is why Lenin's ability to kind of appeal to many people through their common grievances and his ability as an orator and as a leader were a very key factor in the Bolshevik Revolution. These are women marching in Petrograd for better living conditions. Remember, this is all in the context. World War I is happening, and the Germans, of course, knew that the war was having its toll. World War I was a war of attrition in which all the nations almost simultaneously tried to starve each other out in one way or another. And so it had devastating consequence for home fronts of Germany as well as Russia, of Britain and France. But because of a lack of industrialization, because of problems with organized leadership in Russia, Russia suffered earlier and more heavily. And this gave credence to movements who had been seeking to pull the country out of the war, to improve conditions for the people of the country as a whole. This is a demonstration of Petrograd munition workers. So again, the war. These are war manufacturers striking against the government, the Provisional Government of 1917, which was of course headed up by Trotsky. Pictured here, Alexander Kerensky was the head of the government for much of this tumultuous period in 1917. And Kerensky was a passionate leader and very much wore his kind of Russian patriotism on his sleeve, but he also dealt with an incredibly difficult, divided government. Mensheviks, revolutionary socialists, cadets, liberals, Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks were actually, in some respects, the least of his concern. It was the larger groups like the revolutionary socialists that Kerensky had much of the difficulty with. And as Kerensky's in power, the situation increasingly turns violent. There is an attempted coup in which the Russian army moves troops onto Petersburg or Petrograd, and actually Kerensky had to appeal to the socialists and the Bolsheviks to defend the city, which they do, and they turn away the attempted overthrow. It's an incredibly divisive time in which Kerensky has very little ability to govern, and during much of this time period, Kerensky was governing merely through a group of some 5 different people, as the country seemed to be just crumbling out of his control. And he lacked very much directive ability in places that were outside of the most urban center. And here, of course, we have Lenin speaking before the people in Russia in October 1917. Lenin, who comes to power largely through his ability to use a passionate driving speaking ability, through his ability to mobilize people by tapping into their most important grievances. Lenin is aggressive, and Lenin pushes for action early. And so Lenin becomes a driving force behind the revolution. And individuals like Stalin and even Trotsky, who had some differences of opinion with him over issues like the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, will join in supporting Lenin as Lenin pushes to alienate the other opposition groups and create a base of support that will allow his movement to come to power and to put in place a dictatorship of the proletariat, a dictatorship of the people. After Lenin in the revolution succeeds in October of 1917, Lenin begins providing decrees. He gains control over mass media and begins to decree a number of directives. One was the decree of peace, which was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was, for the view of many, like Leon Trotsky, a rather bad treaty in which Russia was forced to give up her control over the Baltic states, over Finland, over Poland, Poland wasn't under their control, but they would not be able to control Poland, over the Ukraine, Belarus. They were forced to give up a huge amount of what they saw as imperial territory that was connected to the Russian Empire. And this was unpopular for some. But of course, Lenin knew that the key grievance at this time had become problems that related to the war, and that if he could pull the country out of the war, this would be a factor in his ability to build support. Of course, also his decree on press, in which he created a group that was really the foundation of the roots of the secret police in the Soviet Union, of the NKVD and later the KGB. And of course, these individuals rooted out political opposition. They rooted out people that were seeking to undermine the revolution and sent them to places like the gulags, or put them to death. And of course, it were these groups that ultimately put to death the Tsar and his family. Lenin's decree on land turned all of the land over to the peasantry and had it seized from the owners, and oftentimes seized with violent force. So Lenin will use these types of actions and his ability as a speaker and a leader to inspire this revolution and to inspire a fundamental change in the Soviet Union, or in Russia that becomes the Soviet Union, and a fundamental change in terms of how socialist and communist philosophy had been understood before this. He tries to assert a planned, regulated dictatorship of the people that would immediately take the country to communism. And of course, most socialists, as I mentioned earlier, were democratic and believed in a long-term evolution, if you will, to that process. While they needed reforms in this time period, they nonetheless felt that the ultimate end of communism would be an epoch's evolution. And Lenin broke from this, and he exacts a dictatorship of the people, as he called it. It's really a leadership of an elite group of professional revolutionaries who made transformative decrees with not a whole lot of expertise on the consequences of these decrees. And the result was transformations in Russia, and really not an improvement of anyone's condition in Russia. Albeit there were some idealized aspects of this, the turning over the land to people, to the people, certainly important in ideological ideas, but ultimately the regulated economies that are put in place by the Bolsheviks, the Soviet Union, are not effective to create an economic turnaround in the country in the short term. All right, thanks, guys. I hope this is helpful.